Welcome, everybody, to the Clinic Technical Assistance Center Clinical Lunch and Learn webinar series. Today's webinar series is on best practices for working with LGBTQ youth in a mental health setting. And we're very excited to have with us today Janae Hubbard. Janae has extensive experience working with adolescents in a variety of different settings, particularly foster care youth, LGBTQ youth, and homeless youth. We're very excited for her to be here today to share a little bit about her experience and her lessons learned in working with LGBTQ youth and really being an advocate on their behalf. But just before we get started, I just want to orient you a little bit to the webinar. Everybody is currently muted. You will have an opportunity to submit questions through the chat boxes on the right-hand side. When you fill in at the bottom, there's a little white box at the bottom. When you type in your question, your comment, or your response, just make sure you click Send to All Panelists in the drop-down, and then click Send, and that way we'll see it. If you don't click Send to All Panelists, we won't be able to see your responses. And there will be a few times during the webinar where we're going to ask you to really kind of share your experiences and participate if at all possible. We also will have a Q&A time at the end of the webinar today. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm now going to pass it on to Janae.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to start out by saying thank you for attending this webinar today. I just wanted to start out by saying that this webinar today is really going to be a conversation. My goal for today is for me to provide and share with you my expertise having worked with LGBT youth in a variety of settings, as Lydia has said. And really, this webinar came together through their shared experience, working with them, understanding what they go through when they enter into mental health settings with different clinicians and therapists, and sort of what can be done to sort of make those experiences more, make them feel safe, make them feel welcome, make them affirm their identity, their orientation. So that's sort of my purpose with this webinar today, is sort of to walk you through sort of what young people go through when they enter into these settings, and sort of what you can do as a clinician, as a therapist, or a provider to make that environment safe for them. And so we'll get started right now, and the first thing I want to do is just kind of go over the agenda. And so what we're going to be doing today is really, like I said, is just sort of building the groundwork for how you work with LGBTQ youth, providing them with an environment that's inclusive as well as safe. So the learning objectives, I'll go over of today's training, as well as different meanings and definitions of LGBTQ, providing you with facts about LGBTQ youth. What does that mean as a young person to have these identities and how they walk through the world? Looking at sort of contextualizing who they are as people in terms of youth development. A lot of times when we talk about LGBT youth, we look at them separately. We look at them as an isolated incident versus them as a whole person, and contextualizing what that means for them as a whole person. And looking at sort of what happens when we isolate them, when there's discrimination, when there's harassment, and sort of what are those adverse effects that happen to them. And then sort of shifting the conversation into what happens as a practitioner and what you can do, and looking at mindful practice, bringing it back to your identity, and sort of what are your biases and what are your sort of hang-ups, quote unquote, that you bring to the table. When we come into these spaces, we all bring our own identities and our own biases. So sort of thinking through that and how we work through that. And then actually providing some actual engagement strategies. What are those strategies? We talk about how to engage, but really trying to provide you with some concrete sort of steps of what you can do to engage young people around their identity and sexual orientation. And lastly, really looking at institutional change. What can your organization as a whole do in order to provide young people with a safe space? And then finally, like I said, we'll do some Q&A. Okay, so today's learning objectives is really to, when you guys leave this, I want you to be able to define sexual orientation, to really understand what does that mean along that spectrum, that we're not just looking at lesbian, gay, and heterosexual, but there's a spectrum of sexual orientation. And I'll go into more details on what I mean by the different categories in comparison to what society says versus how young people feel and what sort of the fluidity that they feel along the spectrum of sexual orientation, as well as gender identity and gender expression, really opening up the conversation around gender identity and gender expression, and not just keeping it sort of in this box that it tends to stay in, but really having a wider discussion on what that looks like. And lastly, giving you guys practical tools for creating a safe and inclusive environment. What does that mean when we say safe space? We hear that a lot. That's a term that's thrown out there. We have a safe space, but what does that really mean? And having worked with young people, it's really important to sort of contextualize what a safe space means to them and what that, and giving you the tools to create that space for them. And so let's kind of go further. And so I want to start out the conversation just sort of to understand who's in the room, what do you guys, if you've worked with this population before, so this is going to be a poll, and I want you guys just to answer, do you have LGBTQ youth as a client? So I'm just going to give you guys a few minutes to answer that question.
So the poll pops up on the right-hand side in your panel, and just click your response and then click submit. And it usually takes a couple of seconds for the responses to be calculated. And then once we have enough respondents, we could probably close out that poll and get a see in terms of what your responses were. Do you have LGBTQ youth as clients? Yes, no, I don't know.
Okay, so we're going to just sort of move on, and I'm looking at the sort of the results. So it seems as a lot of you have LGBT clients, which I think is really important. And so for this, those people who do work with LGBT clients, this is sort of providing you with that space. Hopefully we'll be able to generate some conversation. You guys can give me experiences, respond in the chat box with your experiences of working with LGBTQ youth, what that's like. I really want this to be a conversation. I don't want it to be me just lecturing, me telling you what is happening, but really, since you guys have that experience, to share that experience. And my goal here is to really provide more input and enhance what you're already doing, not necessarily say you're not doing it, but to really provide more concrete tools to what you're already doing. So let's just move forward. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start with sort of the meanings. And when I was thinking and, talking with young people and really thinking through sort of what does it mean for sexual, when they self-identify their sexual orientation or their gender identity or expression, is really giving them the power of language, allowing for them to affirm who they are. And I think it's really important when we're going through definitions and we're really working with the young people is that we allow them to tell us who they are, and really these sort of definitions is so that you as a practitioner have an understanding of when they say that I'm gay or I'm a lesbian or I'm trans, that you know what that means and that you're educated on that without you having to then probe them further. What does that mean? Educate me. Really, a lot of building a safe environment is that you're creating the space for them to identify and for you to listen, and not so much to be exploring for them to tell you who they are, but for you to listen. So sexual orientation is one's emotional sexual attraction to others. And really when we talk about sexual orientation, and in the past, and what really hinders a lot of young people is people just automatically think sex. Who are you having sex with? Who are you sleeping with? And that sometimes comes across as a negative connotation, like who do you sleep with? It's really sexual orientation is about the emotional relationship, not just about the sexual relationship. So I really want to get that out there with sexual orientation, is that we're really talking about the emotional and sexual attraction to others. And usually along the sort of orientation sort of binary or spectrum is there's these categories. There's heterosexual, there's bisexual, there's homosexual. But really when we're talking about this, there's young people can fall across these spectrums on multiple times. They could come in your office one day and say, I identify as bisexual. The next day they can come in and say they're straight. The idea behind this is that we're allowing them within this space to be who they are, and we're affirming that. We're not going to question, oh, well, yesterday you told me you were this, or last week you told me you were this. What we're really saying is, okay, I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to work with you at this moment. And so that's something just to think about with orientation. So then we just go into the L, G, and the B. Really with this, it's the reason I like these definitions, and really when you're working with definitions, is it's really about how the individual themselves identifies. It's not about what you think or what you perceive them to be, but really the power in this and the power in creating a safe space and a safe environment is allowing for that young person to identify for themselves how they feel, how they see themselves. So really when I have these definitions and why I like them is because it says self-identifies. So you look at with the lesbian, that's a woman who self-identifies as having an emotional and or sexual attraction to other women. So like I said before, it's an emotional and it's a sexual attraction. It's not exclusive or fixed on just those things. And then as far as gay men, it's a man who self-identifies as having emotional and or sexual attraction to other men. And bisexual is a person who self-identifies as having an attraction or emotional relationship with both male or female. And just like I was saying before, it's like if you have questions as I'm going through these definitions, feel free to chat in those questions, and I will do my best to try to answer them maybe as I see them pop up or towards the end of the conversation. So then we go into transgender, and I really wanted to spend some time with this, with the T and the LGBT, because gender identity is really a personal, internal choice, and not choice, but it's how they define themselves. And I think that people get stuck a lot in this, especially with young people, because young people like to express themselves and they feel very comfortable. I had a young person that I was working with who one day would come in, it was they identified themselves as female. They were assigned at birth as male, and they would come into my office. One day they would be dressed as a female, the next day they would be dressed as a male, or they'd be dressed as a female with a full beard. And I had to really sit with myself to understand this process, and because I came into it being, it's very fixed. Once you say, oh, I identify as this is my gender, then in my mind I got stuck, and I was like, well, then why every day or every other time I see you, you're dressed differently? And so part of this process is allowing for the young person to explore that spectrum of gender and being very fluid with their gender, and not just for us to be stuck in that, but to go along that journey with them and provide that support around that. So that's what gender identity is, sort of this internal sense of who you are, whether it's male or female or otherwise. And then transgender as a person is gender identity that's different than the sex that you were born with. And you'll see these sort of terms like male to female, female to male, a lot of sort of societal terms like will be like cross-dressing. And those sort of terms are not necessarily where someone wants has a desire to be reassigned their gender, but maybe just wants to dress in the opposite sex. And a lot of those terms sometimes can be seen as negative, so I would caution just when using sort of terms that are not very, like transgender, gender nonconforming, gender expression, gender, that you are really careful with the language and you really allow for the young person to identify with those terms and not for you to assign that to them. And then gender expression is something that I think is really important because this is how a young person represents themselves. And that really comes in the form of their clothing and the way that they wear their hair, if they wear jewelry, if they wear makeup, all of these sort of things with gender expression is really important, because not every time someone says I am transgender that they necessarily want to have reassignment surgery, and I think that's always where people jump to. It's like, oh, you're transgender, so now we're going to jump to reassignment surgery. And a lot of times that's not what the young person is ready for. What they're ready for is to maybe social transition, which means I'm going to now dress the way that I feel inside. And that's a lot of like gender expression, gender nonconformity, is the idea that I'm going to dress how I feel inside. I'm not necessarily saying I want to have reassignment surgery, but I want to express my gender in a physical sort of way, and this is how I'm going to do it. And then so we get to the Q. Now, Q is this, I feel like this is a fairly new term that a lot of people, young people, a lot of people are hearing about, but for young people, queer or Q has been around for a while, and they use it because it allows for them to reference themselves in an orientation that isn't heterosexual. They may not know where they fall along the lines, but they definitely don't feel that they're heterosexual or that they're straight. So for them, it's like, I don't know. I consider myself to be queer because I don't know where I fall along on this binary, and it's easier for me to identify under this larger umbrella term. Queer in the past has had a very negative connotation, but young people today and a lot of people within the LGBTQ movement have embodied this because it allows them to reaffirm their identity. And so they've taken the word back and they've made it into something that's more of a power statement. Now, I know that a lot of people before think of Q as questioning, which it can follow into that too. So it's not exclusive, like it either means queer or it means questioning. It just, questioning can follow that too, because there are a lot of young people, especially young people, who are going to be like, I don't even know. I don't know my identity. I don't know my sexual orientation. I'm questioning that. And that leads us into why we need to create this safe space, is to give them that opportunity to work through those questions and for you to help them through that questioning period. And then gender queer also, it falls along the same lines of queer, but it's really looking at your gender presentation, your gender identity, saying, I don't necessarily identify as male or female, and so I fall under sort of a genderqueer identity. You may hear also terms under genderqueer like androgynous. Those are terms that people use, a lot of young people use, that I'm androgynous, and that's the idea that I kind of feel both. I feel a little bit of male, I feel a little bit of female, and so that's sort of like what I want you guys to get from this, like all of these sort of questions, is that young people need to have that space to be able to identify however they feel. And a lot of the work that I was doing with young people was they would come in and they experience, and why I think this is important, they would say, you know, I went and saw this therapist and they just looked at me wrong. They were like looking at me because I present as male even though I'm female, and they really couldn't get past my presentation in order to work with me. And because they couldn't, I no longer want to work with them. I think the most important thing to think about when we're talking about definitions and language and power is that the young person has the space to feel comfortable however they come into your office, and that you understand these sort of different identities and orientation along that spectrum, and that you're not fixing your mind around what you think they should be presenting as, that you have the space to be whoever they want to be in that moment. So let's move forward. Yeah, so it's just things to think about, and I like the idea of like reaffirming who you are and taking back words and using, I just think there's power in language, and I think for us to dismiss that and to be very flippant about ways that how we identify a young person is really taking away from their power. And I like this sort of visual. I think it's a really good visual. It's from pronouncedmetrosexual.com, and it's called The Gingerbread Man. And really what I like about this is it gives you sort of like all the definitions, everything I just went over. It gives you a very nice visual of how that follows along an individual. So when you look at gender identity, you're really looking at their mind. What do they think? How do they feel? Their brain, what does it tell them that their identity is? Is it what they were born with, or is it something different? And that really comes from your head. And sexual orientation is really your feelings. Who am I attracted to emotionally and sexually? It's not just what society tells me I'm supposed to be attracted, but internally, who am I really attracted to? And then you have physical sex, which is just what you're assigned to at birth. And that really, that's a fixed thing, and you know, we could get into gender reassignment surgery and gender dysphoria, but really in the conversation, it's really having the understanding that the young person can choose to go with their identity, and it's not necessarily, oh, let me change my sex. It's really, this is what I'm feeling. And then gender expression, which I love, this little green box, is really, I think it works both ways. It's how we present ourselves to the world and how the world perceives us. This is our gender expression. And really just thinking through sort of, what does that mean? When I put on, for me, for example, I dress very butch, which is a term that it's within the community means masculine. But yet in my head, I feel very female. I know that I'm female. I have no desire to be male, but I'm comfortable in expressing my gender in a masculine, quote-unquote, way. So I think that that's really important to understand sort of where do these feelings come from, how does gender identity come out, and you as a therapist, as a clinician, support them in that, okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to just do a little chat of myths and facts about LGBTQ individuals. And so I'm just presenting this myth or fact, and I want you just to chat in if you think it's a myth or if you think it's a fact, and I'll give you a few seconds for that. So myth or fact, most lesbians or gay people want to be members of the opposite sex.
So again, just use that chat box on the right-hand side of your computer. I think I just typed in chat your responses here. Looks like we're getting some responses in, and it seems like people are saying myth over and over again.
Yes. So that is, in fact, it is a myth. And the reason I put this in here is because it is very, people still believe that. People still think, oh, you're a lesbian, that means you want to be a man, or you're gay, that means you want to be a female. So I think that's something just to think about. Next myth or fact is you can tell someone is LGBT by the way they walk or talk. So just once again, type it in, and we will wait for a few seconds, and then we'll move on. So just from the things that are coming in, it looks like a lot of people believe that this is a myth. So let's see if you're correct. And yes, this is a myth. There's very few people within the LGBTQ spectrum actually exhibit any of these stereotypes. It's just not something that is out there, but people really want to believe that they can tell and they know, but really that's not true. And so we'll just move on to the next one. Myth or fact, many transgender people hate their bodies. So just sort of think through this one, and we will give you a few seconds.
And it seems like people are submitting that it's a myth over and over again.
Yes. So with this one, this was a bit of a trick question, is that it's partially fact. Because of the oppression that a lot of transgender individuals feel with not being able to express, especially young people, not being able to express the fact that they feel different than their assigned gender, that this becomes a problem. This becomes something that they become to hate themselves, become to hate their bodies, and it hurts their self-esteem because they're not allowed to express who they really feel that they are. This is a manifestation of sort of being isolated, being discriminated against, and told you can't be this. So that is a partial fact. I'm not saying all transgender people feel that way, but there is a significant number, and research has shown that they do.
Yeah, I like the way one of you submitted, said, well, myth, but then again, it depends. So I think that sort of summarizes a little bit of the response to that question.
And I mean, and like Lydia was saying, and what the person responded as well, is that all of these things we're going to move into relate to if a young person's given space, if they're given space to really affirm who they are with these adverse effects, with things like self-esteem and body image below, if they were given that space. And so that's really what this discussion is about. And I think this is the last one. Kids are too young to know if they are gay. And is this a myth or a fact? And so just go ahead and feel free to type in. And we got a lot of feedback. It looks like a lot of people are saying that it's a myth. And this is a myth. Most research states that sexual orientation is innate, that it's not a choice, and that a lot of young people, early as 3 and 4, are able to recognize. They may not have the words to say, I am this, but they have the feelings, and there's understanding there around what they feel. Yeah, and I think as someone typed in that there's one of the observations is that they think that it is based on people thinking there's no present sexual attraction, whether straight or gay, at a young age. And I think that's true. I think like what people feel is that the younger you are, the less you know about attraction. And like I was saying before, it's really around, you may not have the words to articulate what attraction means, but I think young people know. I always tell the story for myself, is that I knew at 4 that I liked women. And I grew up in an environment where no one ever said anything negative or positive about LGBTQ people. So in my head, I just assumed that meant it was okay. But I knew at a very, very young age, and that's for me, my identity. But I feel like that's a known fact. I couldn't tell you what it was. I couldn't say I was a lesbian at 4, but I knew the feeling. And so I'm just going to move on to the next thing. So really what I show you this slide is really just to sort of bring it kind of home to as what young LGBT youth face. And a lot of these statistics are very dire. As I was typing this out and I was working through sort of this presentation, I really was astounded by just how severe the violence and derogatory language and slurs and everything that happens to young LGBTQ youth. For 80% of them to be called derogatory names at their school, their environment, that's a primary place of socialization. And for them to be told in that environment that they're not, that they're called names, that they're, and just like you're not worthy of your identity. And the part for me that was even more shocking was that 18% of those, or 1/5 of those kids, this is coming from their faculty and their staff, that this is coming from authorities, this is coming from people that they are looking up to, who are their role models, who they are learning how to navigate through this world from. So it's really interesting that this is what happens to young people. And just going through, the statistics are very it's just hard, and I think you could see from the numbers that a lot of stuff happens. So there's a lot of physical violence, sexual assault, things like that happen, and I think it's just really important to keep that in mind of all that the young person is bringing into the environment when you meet with them. So one thing I wanted to do is just sort of bringing it all home and thinking through. So we talked about definitions, we were talking about sort of their identity, we were talking about just what happens to them and sort of the isolation, and just really young LGBTQ. The bottom line is young people are just, the LGBT youth are just like other youth. They want everything that every other youth, they want their independence, they want to actualize their normative behaviors, and in that meaning, if they have an attraction, they want to be able to participate in that and fully explore their sexual identity or their gender expression or identity. And that's the thing that we have to always remember, is that these young people, on top of going through puberty and finding themselves in who they are, there's this added thing of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, and that they want that space to explore all of themselves, not just part of themselves, but all of themselves. And so that's something to really think about when you're sitting down and working with a young person. Okay, so here's another chat question, is sort of, what are some of the adverse effects LGBTQ youth could face due to the stressors of discrimination and harassment? So really with this question is just take some time in the chat box, well, not too much time, but just enough time that you can kind of throw out what you think. Do you think that they're going to be depressed, or different things like that happen, or what you see in your work? Because a lot of you said that you do work with young people. So what are you seeing? So I see homelessness, attempted suicide. There's definitely depression that comes from this, and I think it's really important. So drug use, definitely depression, anger. A lot of the young people that I work with were so angry when they would come in, and that we would have to spend so much time of just suppressing the anger and letting them know that they were safe before we could even begin to do the work. So I think it's really important. So I'm just going to move on and sort of show you what those adverse effects are. It's really just thinking about, like a lot of you guys said you see it. I'm not going to read through all of them, and you can see sort of what are those facts. And once again, I think the suicide is really huge right now, as a lot of young people, a lot of LGBTQ youth are committing suicide. As you saw from the previous statistics, this is an issue. They go to school, there's not a safe place for them there, and they don't know that we have the It Gets Better campaign and different things like that. But in isolation, it's really hard to see that future. So just thinking through those sort of things. And one thing that I found when doing this, sort of putting this together, was eating disorders. I thought that was something that really stood out. Was looking at gay males and how they're 7 times more likely than straight males to have eating disorders. I think that's really an important statistic, and the reason I put it in is for you to think holistically with the individual. When they come in, they may not want to identify, they may not be identified, you may not even know their how they identify, but some of these symptoms, some of these effects can lead you down that path to maybe being more open, maybe allowing them to be more open. And if they are allowed to be more open, maybe some of these will diminish in the process. So let's just move on. And so some of you guys talked about sort of the adverse effects, and really what it comes down to it is just a feeling of isolation. It leads to a lot of self-hatred and poor coping skills, which leads into the substance abuse, which leads into they don't know how to deal with these sort of like these pressures of being a young person on top of their identity, on top of their sexual orientation. So it's really important to understand and contextualize all of this into how do you work with them when they sit down in that chair. What are all of the things that they're feeling and they're going to face? And hopefully we'll cover what sort of steps you can do to make that a comfortable and safe environment. Okay, so we're going to watch a video.
So the video will be, our host will show the video in just a moment. If you happen to have trouble viewing the video, just let us know in the chat box.
Hi, so I saw that for some of you, that the sound and there may be a little bit of a delay with the video, so I'm just going to kind of summarize what the video was about and what the clip was about. It was about this kid named Joseph and his story, and really what I wanted you to get from this video is that when given the space by his guidance counselor to when he said, I think I kind of like guys, and the guidance counselor was like, oh, that's okay. You hear from him this sort of like, oh, I was able to let out this breath, that I had this space, that I was able to really, then I felt comfortable, and that the counselor said, you know, whatever stays in here, whatever you say in here stays in here. And sort of what I was trying to get from this video and what I thought was just really powerful was what that did for this young person. Once they had that space, that safe space, they were able then to disclose who they were to themselves, to the therapist, and then eventually to their family. And having that support from their mother was also very important. So I really like this story because I think that it gives you a wider sort of understanding of the power of safe spaces, the power of language, the power of affirming. And one thing I just want to let you know is that the recording and the slides and everything is saved here on the CTAC website, so you will be able to go back and retrieve this and watch this film at a later date if you want to really see what it was about. So I'm just going to move forward now, and really what I want to talk about, and I think that this is a really important step, is talking about mindful practice. This is something that I think all of us sort of, as therapists, as social workers, clinicians, we all have to come into our work with this idea of mindful practice. And really what I'm talking about in particular with working with LGBTQ youth is recognizing your own biases. Yeah, what does it mean to work with this population for yourself? And so here are some questions, and really what I want you to do is read through these questions and really think about how you feel, how are you responding to these questions. And so you can chat in if you like, how your responses, but really what I want is for you to hold these sort of feelings through the rest of this PowerPoint presentation of and think through what does this mean for your work that you need to do outside of. Okay, so I'll read through the questions. So what first message did you hear about LGBTQ people? Were they positive, were they negative, or neutral? How would you feel if someone came out to you? What was your first initial thought? Really think about that. What do you think it would feel like if your child, mother, father, or sibling came out? Would you be treated by a transgender doctor? And lastly, have you ever been to an LGBT event? And why or why not? So really sit with these and think through. I see some people are responding to that. I think that that's great. And really this is for you to understand sort of what your relationship is to LGBTQ people before you even do the work with LGBTQ youth. What is your relationship with them? And so we're going to move into the next thing. And the reason I bring this up, and something that I find that is really powerful in thinking through and doing my own work, even though I identify as LGBTQ, I still had, questions, and I was still curious about individuals and their identity and what that meant. And I had to learn for myself that my curiosity and what me knowing about their orientation or gender identity doesn't impact the care that I provide to them. That my work with them is to be very mindful of their identity, but to do work outside of that, like looking up information around transgender individuals, around different sexual orientations and identity, and understanding it fully before I come into the room and use that moment to ask those questions. That's not the moment. It's not their responsibility of the young person to educate us on gender and sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual orientation. That's not their job. That's our job to do that work outside of. So that's why I throw in sort of the curiosity factors. Really think as you sit with it, what does that mean that you feel these certain ways? So what we're going to talk about is just what are the keys to creating a safe space. And you can just chat it in really quickly, and I will sort of go through it.
So again, just use that chat box on the right-hand side, and if you have any strategies that have been helpful in creating a safe space, anything that you think you have utilized that would be helpful for others to know, please share those in the chat box, and we'll make sure to say those to others.
Yeah, so one person wrote in acceptance. I think that is a huge key to creating a safe space. Trust, as someone else just typed in, I definitely think that's a huge thing. So I'm going to read this definition of defining a safe space. I found this definition on creatingasafespace.com. They really work with individuals and doing group work and what that means, and not just saying this is a safe space, but how do you actually go about doing it. So it says a safe space is a place where anyone can relax and be able to fully express without fear of being made to feel uncomfortable, unwelcome, or unsafe on account of biological sex, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, cultural background, religious affiliation, age, or physical or mental ability. I really like this because it's all-encompassing. It's not just very specific to LGBTQ youth, but it's saying if you allow for all of these sort of individuals with their different identities, race, ethnicity, orientation, to be safe in this environment and to feel relaxed and comfortable, you're in the way of starting a safe space. So let's go into engagement strategies. So a lot of you I've seen as you're typing through, you're talking about creating a space visually. I think that's very important. I think that young people walk into a space, and if they don't feel comfortable by what they see, by representations of themselves, they shut down. They're like, nope, I didn't see anyone that looked like me. I don't see any literature or posters that reflected who I was, and they're done. They're not going to participate anymore. I've spoken to several youth where they're like, no, I left the building because when I walked in, there was nothing that, they didn't even have a flyer that represented me, so I wasn't going to stay. So I think it's really important that you think about your lobby, your building, and your own office, that you have sort of these images for them to feel comfortable in that space before you even sit down and talk with them, that when they're in your lobby, in your chair, that they feel safe and they see representations of themselves. And so I put in some samples of the things that I like about this is that these are free. You can go to the website. I have some links at the end of the PowerPoint in which you can download these, that you can place them anywhere around your office, just in your space. I think that these are things that it doesn't always have to be like this is a safe space. It can be anything that really just reflects identity. It reflects sexual orientation. I have a professor once who's told me that, you know, to get books that you could place on your shelf that have labels with the binding out that talk about gender identity or, you know, LGBTQ equals love, you know, stuff like that, that doesn't have to be this blatant, like, look at me sign, but just it's placed there and they know that it exists, and that's what's important. So some people talked about it when I said, what does it mean to create safe space? They already said some of these things. They said things about, and what I really think about creating a safe space is we say this is a safe space, but we don't always understand what does that mean to create a safe space. And so in thinking this through, I wanted to sort of provide what are those sort of key things that it means in creating a safe space. And I think of the idea of establishing ground rules. A lot of people have done groups, and when you walk into a group, you have these ground rules. I think that can always apply into individual settings where you and the young person are working together, and that's something that I've always tried to do, was work with them in a way that they know what to expect every time they come in my office, that we've established these ground rules. And these are things that you already do. It's really just being mindful to remember to tell them that these are things that you already do. And so it's confidentiality. What is said here stays here. It's really that sort of thing, you know, mutual respect. And when I talk about respect, it's a lot more than just, I respect your views. It's really like when they say, I'm dating someone of this sex, and it's the same sex, that you acknowledge that and you respect that, and that you don't demean their beliefs or ideas. And second is accountability with under that sort of ground rules. It's like, I will do what I say and I say what I'll do, you know, within your sort of relationship that you're working with them, that you establish these sort of, this idea that when I say I'm going to do something, I mean it. A lot of young people struggle, especially if you saw the statistics of authorities who are harassing them or giving them slurs. They need an authority figure and an adult in their life who, when they say they're going to do something, they actually do it. And they want that accountability, and they want to have that space that you're going to be accountable to. And then I talk about being an empathetic listener. And this is really like applying all of the skills that you already have from, you know, motivational interviewing, active listening, and really applying it to this and being present. And when I say grounded in a conversation, that means that you're really in the conversation with them. I'm not meaning in the sense of you're oversharing or you're giving all these personal, but more in the sense of you're really aware of what they're saying, and you work to really hear what they're saying, and you are able to repeat back what you think and feel they're saying. And then also give space, take space. And a lot of times for young people, they come into spaces with authorities and they realize the authority thinks they know everything. They're the authority. They don't give the space for them to talk as a young person. It's really important for them to have that space. So just moving forward, one thing that continue on these engagement strategies is being supportive. Is really the thing that I love about this is thinking through is you want to be consistent in line with the same way that you treat heterosexual young people. It shouldn't be any different, that they should be able, young people, LGBTQ, should be able to have that space to talk about their attraction, to express themselves, whether it's their hair or their clothes, that they have that space. One thing that I remember a young person told me was that they always felt blamed for their identity, and that's why I put this in here, sort of like, don't equate their romantic relationships with acting out. I've heard this from other clinicians and therapists where they say, oh, that person's just acting out, you know, if they're dating someone of the same sex or if they're dressing opposite of their gender norm, they say they're acting out. And I think that that's really detrimental, and that really negates the space that you're trying to create, a positive space, by saying, I think this is just part of your acting out. So I think it's really important that we really recognize that. And so overall, so you have this sort of like, what do you do when they come in your office, setting up this space? And I just want to really lastly kind of come to the point of institutional changes, you know, and really for you to think through what does your organization do as a whole to make these spaces welcoming. And so just to go through and sort of ask yourself these questions as you come back and you're working with your organization, sort of what do they do? So just thinking about, does your organization provide training on LGBTQ-related topics and issues similar to this webinar? Is this organizational-wide? Was everybody invited to participate in this? Does your organization's mission and value statement reflect language that is LGBTQ inclusive? So that's a lot of stuff like, do you have pamphlets? Do you have things that your mission is saying, we support this community and we support young people in this way? Does your organization have LGBT inclusive literature that appears on the website and all organizational material? So this is just definitely trying to really make sure that whatever is out in your lobby, whatever information you're handing to the young person, that they're reflected in that information, that it talks about that we serve this community, we work with this community, you really want that language to be there. Does your agency have non-discrimination policy? Most agencies do. It's really looking at what does that say and how do we enforce it, so really thinking through that. And lastly, does your agency forms, are they gender neutral? This is something that's important. If a young person's filling out a form and they can't find where to check for their gender because all it gives you the options of male and female, that's really a problem, and that's limiting, and that makes them feel uncomfortable. So what we're going to do is sort of go into sort of the key points and takeaway from today's webinar is that, one can't assume everyone's straight. All your clients aren't going to walk in and are not straight, that you can't make that assumption. You can't even make that assumption about their gender. Is the way that they present is the way that they are. And not to pathologize LGBTQ as a symptom or a problem. I see that a lot where young people are like, well, they said it's a problem. And really it isn't a problem. It's their identity, it's their orientation, and it's up to us to sort of help them work through that and then provide them with the support to be able to navigate that identity orientation into the world. And do not blame, condemn, scrutinize, or criticize. And I go back to the idea of just sort of like it's your fault for these things happening to you. I look at this like the quote is, if you didn't dress that way, then you wouldn't get bullied. This is really important way to think, because a lot of times we say these subtle things, and it's really impactful. You're really denying them who they are by saying you shouldn't do that. So I really think it's important that we affirm them. Like, I'm sorry that happened to you because of who you are. How do we move forward? How do we support them in that? And just so, bringing it all together. So I really enjoyed this conversation and having people's participation in via the chat box. I think it's really important that this conversation continue, and think of this as the beginning and not the end of the conversation, and that really when you're building safe and inclusive environments, this is daily, that you need to do this as a daily necessity. This isn't just a one-time isolated thing because today at 2 your LGBT youth is coming in, but that always you're practicing this, because it's really eventually you want this always to be a safe environment for any young person that comes in, regardless, because eventually you want them to be able to open up to you. And so that's really it. I'll leave you with this quote. You can read it and feel free to discuss, and we're now going to, I just want to say thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Sinead. That was a really great presentation, and I think what it was particularly helpful from a clinician perspective or mental health provider perspective was really kind of thinking through that some of the engagement strategies that we tend to utilize are particularly important for this population in terms of creating a safe space and being very mindful of that.
Yes.
And mindful about being consistent in doing that, because you never know if one of your clients is kind of thinking about this or struggling with this identity issue. You don't want to sort of traumatize them again like others may have. and some of the other systems that they may be participating in. So we do have a couple minutes for questions, and we have some questions that came in. And, Janae, I think there's a really good one here, and considering your expertise in working with LGBTQ youth who run away or are homeless, do you have any specific suggestions or recommendations for working with them?
For working with LGBTQ
youth who are homeless or tend to run away? Any different types of strategy you would recommend?
I mean, a lot of the PowerPoint came from working with them directly, and I think a lot of them are products of going through sort of systems that aren't affirming and aren't welcoming, and so they kind of disengage from those systems, and part of that disengagement becomes living on the streets. So I think it's still providing them with that space that they felt that they didn't get, and so because they didn't get that, they're now forced to be in sort of this environment that is off the grid. And I think it's just important when you are working with them that you bring it back to that you bring it back and you validate their experience and you affirm for them what happened and really try to help them bridge those sort of feelings and move it forward.
Great, thank you so much, Janae. And we have a couple other questions. So what are the best ways that LGBTQ workers can support LGBTQ youth? And I know that was something you and I talked about before the presentation.
I mean, I think it's really important that as an LGBT identified individual who's working with LGBTQ youth, that you really try to secure and affirm the space that they're in, from your office, the lobby, everything like that. I don't go so much into you expressing that this is how I identify, and then so that's like building that bond, because really what the young people are wanting is for you to affirm them, and for you to provide them with that space. You can support them through understanding what they've been through and how it's rough for them, and you can be empathetic in that way. You are more empathetic because you have experienced it, potentially have experienced it yourself. So it's really just being present in that and understanding that your perspective is going to be greater in that you've gone through it yourself, and you can provide them with a greater context of how to move through that experience.
Great, thank you so much. And we also had another question that was a little bit different, and it was a clinician that said that some of her adolescent youth clients tend to say homophobic things or have internalized homophobia and things like that. Yeah. And she didn't say whether they consider themselves to be LGBT or Q, but that they were kind of expressing these concerns, and how can you work with them and address some of that homophobia as well, if you have any recommendations?
I mean, I think the biggest recommendation is to address it in the moment. I think that there's ways to address with the young people sort of what is appropriate and inappropriate language, and really explain to them the harm in using that language, the harm that comes to those individuals who identify in that way. I think a lot of times young people just don't know, and I think we're in the position of providing them with the context for what that means, and how that language is really impactful in a way that really hurts young people's self-esteem. And not even their self-esteem, there's adverse effects that happen to them. I mean, the depression, the suicide. I have often tried to challenge people in my environment of just really doing their own independent research of what happens to LGBTQ youth, what they go through, what are the statistics, and really educating them, because I think once you provide that education, their ignorance they can't depend on the ignorance. So I think it's really important to provide them with that education.
Great, thank you so much, Janae. And it looks like we're about at the end of our webinar. I just want to maybe ask one final question, which is a person says that they facilitate a youth group with one member identifying as transgender. How could I approach the conversation of having the other youth address him using his gender preferred pronoun instead of female?
I think a really good thing, there's definitely a lot of icebreakers that you could start the conversation of how people give your name, give your preferred gender pronoun, and I think that that's a way to start in a group, especially. It's good to start with icebreakers and sort of giving that space for them and build on that conversation. I think that that's a way to open it, is to sort of say, there's this really good another like activity icebreaker sort of thing where you have people write down 5 things on an index card, and each time you tell them to take certain things away, and you ask them at the end of that, what did that feel like, that all of these things that you identify as are now taken, and sort of allowing young people to sort of see, like, what are the effects and what does that feel like when you're denied these sort of pieces of yourself, and then build on that conversation of what does that feel like and go from there, and pulling in identity and this young person's identity, not necessarily naming the young person, but pulling in that they are now being denied and what that feels like.
Great, wonderful. Thank you again, Janae, for a really wonderful presentation. There will be a feedback survey that pops up when you close out. Please feel free to let us know what you thought of the webinar, and if there are any additional topics that you think would be helpful for us to cover specific to LGBTQ youth, or any other clinical issues that you think would be helpful in these Lunch and Learn webinar series. So our contact information is posted on the slide here. The resources will also, so just as a reminder, the webinar recording, the PowerPoint slides, a link to the video, and the resources will all be posted on ctacny.com, and I believe the slides were recently just posted, so at least you can have those right away. The webinar recording takes a little bit of time. Our next Lunch and Learn will be in June. Details to be announced, but it will be around the changes in the DSM and working with the new DSM-5. So check back on our website again, ctacny.com, for any updates on that, and as well as check your email for our announcements. So I just want to thank everybody again for participating. This is a very lively webinar. I really appreciate everybody's responses and participation, and just want to thank you again. And please come back to our following webinars in the coming months and check our website, ctacny.com. And thank you again, Janae, for a wonderful and informative presentation. And please have a wonderful day. Take care.